Was Zina's marriage to Henry really unhappy? It may be more fruitful to ask what is meant when unhappiness is asserted. Was Zina unhappy with Henry's treatment of her? Was Zina unhappy living in poverty for her 5 years with Henry? Did Zina simply have unhappy memories of the time and project those memories onto the marriage with Henry? We really don't know. From first-hand contemporaneous accounts in the 1840s, it appears that Zina was not necessarily unhappy in her marriage. To be sure, we can reasonably impute unhappiness from her diary entries that recount family sickness or death of loved ones. But none of this unhappiness, which seems the lot for many during the period, does she seem to blame on Henry. Instead, she is a supportive wife, and he is as attentive a husband as he can be. It is also possible that Zina's views on the marriage changed over time. As she acquired a more stable life in Utah, she may have been able to compare it to her old life and thereby come to the conclusion that she was unhappy. It is also possible that Zina felt that explaining her first marriage as unhappy was an easier way to deal with the questioning of friends, family, and strangers than to explain the complex reasoning that led to her and Henry's decision to dissolve the marriage. Whether Zina really decided her lot had been unhappy or it was created as a convenient explanation, we will never know. All we do know is that the marriage does not appear, on critical review, to have had any outward signs of unhappiness. It does not seem to have been any more troubled than those of her contemporaries. Extant letters indicate that even though Henry married other women after Zina, his heart remained fixated on her, remembering the happy times in preference to the hard times he later had. In this regard, Henry is no different than many today who, after their marriage dissolves, realize what they lost and pine away with desire for what once was. Besides marrying Asenath, there is no evidence that there is also evidence that Henry married Sarah Taylor in Arizona in 1850. He was also disfellowshipped in January 1851 in absentia, apparently in relation to performing an unauthorized plural marriage for W. Phelps as Henry was traveling with Phelps to winter quarters from Cambria, New York. Phelps was excommunicated for having entered the marriage. Henry was disfellowshipped for having performed the marriage. A visit with Henry is recorded in California in the December 12, 1852 diary entry of Caroline Barnes Crosby. She indicates that Henry had lived in California for 3 or 4 years and that he had been left by his wife. Whether that was Asenath or Sarah, we do not know. He stayed with the Crosbys for the holidays, and in the first few days of 1853, plans on marrying Mary Clausen, a local widow. A week later, January 10, 1853, Carolyn reports that Henry was married to Mary in Carolyn's home. Within a few months, the marriage dissolved, for Carolyn records on March 20th, 1853, that Mary called on her and looked very sad, said she had been weeping, gave us an account of her late husband, Henry B. Jacobs, leaving her in consequence of his old wife coming and claiming her previous right. The previous wife that caused the dissolution of Henry's new marriage was either Asenath or Sarah, we don't know which. The decision to remarry was not without religious fallout, as Caroline records that Henry was disfellowshipped in consequence of unlawful conduct in regard to matrimony at a church conference on April 9, 1853. At this time, Henry was disfellowshipped twice in 2 different areas. The next time that any documents mention Henry is September 2nd, 1858, when he writes a very poignant, heartbreaking letter to Zina from his home in Sacramento. There are no extant letters from Henry to Zina from the time he arrives back from his mission in 1847 until this one in 1858. It is clear, however, that his thoughts concerning his past relationship with Zina weigh heavily on his mind. The letter doesn't mention any current wife. He apparently has recently learned of his disfellowshipment in Utah, and he is depressed over his situation in life. He longs to again be with Zina and to see his children. Nothing more is heard about Henry for almost 20 years. Family tradition is strong, however, that he kept in touch with his children, Zebulon and Cheriton, who finally persuaded Henry to return to Utah, where he rejoined the church and became active again. This move apparently occurred in early 1880, as on May 8th of that year, Oliver Huntington recorded in his diary that Henry Jacobs came from California to spend the remainder of his days with his sons in Salt Lake by their request. Henry died on August 1st, 1886, and was buried in the Jacobs family plot in Salt Lake City Cemetery. It is tempting for those reading the heartbreaking letters of from Henry to Zina, to assert that somehow Brigham stole Henry's family. Such a conclusion treats Zina and her children as objects that can be physically stolen, like any of Henry's other possessions, such as a horse, or a jacket, or a pocket watch. Zina, however, was not an object, and neither were her children. Zina certainly had a choice in her marriages, and she showed on more than one occasion that she was willing and capable of exercising that choice. The fact that she chose to be married to Brigham in Nauvoo, chose to move into his housing in winter quarters, chose to not live with Henry in winter quarters after his mission, chose to go to Salt Lake and live in Brigham's housing there, and finally to live publicly as Brigham's plural wife, all indicate that Zina played an active part in the dissolution of her marriage to Henry and the establishment of her marriage to Brigham. While it is true that many of Henry's post-1846 letters to Zina are heartbreaking, none of them indicate that he felt Brigham had stolen his family, and none of them indicate any animosity towards Brigham. While a modern reader, putting himself in Henry's place, might feel that Brigham had stolen his family, this does not change the fact that Henry apparently did not feel that way. Marital patterns among the Mormon insiders of the 1840s were anything but simple. Because of this, it is important to go back and examine the source documents from the period so far as they are available before coming to any conclusions concerning Mormon marriage in general or a single marriage in particular. This is especially true when it comes to the marital relationships between Zina Huntington and her men, Henry Jacobs, Joseph Smith, and Brigham Young. It is easy to jump to conclusions and say any or all of the participants were somehow misguided, wrong, victims, or evil. All of these judgments and more have been pronounced upon this complex situation by authors, historians, and critics over the years. Each reviewer comes to the available documents with their own notions and biases and tends to view those documents through the lens of those preconceptions. It should be no surprise that those critical of polygamy, polyandry, or the Mormons in general would find plenty in Zina's situation to feed their criticisms. Likewise, those predisposed positively towards Mormonism can find many points to similarly support their positions. The fact of the matter is, however, that there will never be enough data about Zina and her men to permit an analysis that fully and clearly favors one side or the other. It should be evident from the sources considered in this paper that a complex situation requires a complex analysis. There are no pat answers. It should also be clear that many of the commonly accepted so-called facts concerning Zina and her men are nothing more than myth or canonized polemic. Dispelling such should be an easy task, but only time will tell if such a task has been adequately achieved. In making sense of Zina and her men, it is best to remember that those involved were no different than any of us. These were people dedicated to serving their God and willing to do whatever that entailed. Even though we, from the lofty perch time has afforded us, might not agree with how they conducted their lives, charity would dictate that we climb down from that perch and exercise compassion rather than dismissive judgment. Critics have, and certainly will, cherry-pick items to defame Zina, her men, and the church that they helped to build. But the full record of their lives tells a series of stories that have left an indelible and incredibly faithful mark on history. Thank you.